Alright, today we're going to talk about style. Does it matter? Does it affect tournament matchups? We've all played people we did well against, we've all played people we did badly against. Sometimes both seem like they're overall equally good players, but we have a lot more trouble with one than the other. And so here I'm going to try to identify, or attempt to identify, like, can I see style? Can we see style in results? Do players of certain styles do better against players of other styles? And this is going to be kind of difficult to judge, and I will say in advance, I don't think I do a very good job nailing this down. But first, we have to identify who does play different styles. Well, first, we have to identify what are different styles, and then who plays within them, and then look at the results and see if it's borne out. And it might be that there are clear styles we can find that have advantages against other styles, but it might also be that styles are more specific and unique to players, and when we group them together and try to generalize, we don't find very much. So we'll see. Um, I think this note, I say the same things I just said. I'm, as always, very well organized. And of course, you might have a stylistic disadvantage and still win because you're so strong, or might have a style advantage and lose because the other person plays really well. And this is all going to be small samples. This is why I group players together into stylistic groups, is because, if one player plays, 60 tournament games over their career, and only so many are going to be against other players I include in the style stuff, so maybe we're down to like 10 or 12 games, and suddenly the samples just get so small it's hard to read much into. And if there are, six different styles, if those 10 or 12 games are one or two game against each style, whether you went 0 and 1 or 2 and 0 or something, is not very telling. So I have combined players into groups to try to make the samples a little bit larger than they would be otherwise. Is there anything else here that I haven't really said? Yes, we're liable to overfit. Given that it's small samples, if something pops up, we're liable to say, wow, that's a real effect, but it's still probably a small sample. So it can be very hard to tell. So Broccoli wrote an article in maybe 2011 or 12 about the different styles, and she made this chart of, we have the x-axis is defensive to aggressive, and the y-axis is a reactive to an initiative-focused player. And so you can have aggressive initiative players, but you can also have aggressive reactive players. You can have defensive initiative and defensive reactive. And she divides players into these four styles, and I gave sort of spark notes on each, and I'm going to read what she wrote while it shows the spark notes version. So defensive, listed first because it is most common and also easiest for most players to become decent at. All players will have some minimal level of defense if they are competent, and having such will not place them in this category. The defensive player goes above and beyond this basic level of defense and will play safely all of the time. The aim of the defensive player is to not lose. As such, most decent defensive players will have a reputation for tying a lot in general, and or taking the first easy tie they see. At mid-levels, they tend to miss non-obvious wins for obvious ties, and tend to be weaker at calculations than other equal-level players as a result. At higher levels, they become those annoying players in tournaments who tie you no less than 10 times until you or they make a mistake. One major advantage that defensive players have over other styles is that they are least likely to fall for traps. A defensive player will always be on the lookout for anything that looks unsafe to them, so it is very difficult to bait them into taking anything too soon. However, because they'll only play what looks safe to them, there are ways of taking advantage of this. For example, if you can set up a match so that no move looks safe, you will often have the advantage. Because of defensive players' tendency to tie tons, it's also easier to tie against them until you get the turn that you want. Since all players are human, even the best defense can be broken. If you don't give up, eventually your opponent will make a mistake, even if it takes 20 ties to get to that point. Several defensive players are also overly willing to use their most powerful cards in the beginning, such as by playing VV and 9 at the beginning of the match. Defensive play is not turn dependent, it can do equally well first or second turn. However, it is very common to see a player who is both defensive in general and falls under one of the turn dependent styles. More on that later. Some common hand-making tendencies. A will often fill their hands with power cards, high edge cards, what I call corner cards, for the level, triple numbers, anything that can take back these cards, etc. The main use of the power cards is to keep them safe. B, more likely than any other players to use AA rares, especially corners. Corner AAs are often used as starters. So I guess I'm gonna do like little bit of comment on each of these. I'm gonna go into how I think of style and how it's different in a bit. Um, the thing that jumped out at me was the kind of defensive players as people who tide a lot. And I'm not sure that accords with who I think of as players who tide a lot in tournament games. Um, but, anyways, we don't have to get into this. Let's go to aggressive traits. Aggressive. Most players just starting out have some aggressive tendencies, like always taking their opponent's cards. Until a player learns the minimal amount of defense it takes to be competent, a low-level aggressive player is basically a free win for anyone else. A competent aggressive player is one that aims to secure a win any way possible. Traps, unsafe-looking moves, and risk-taking are common in an aggressive playstyle. These players tend to not have many ties except against defensive players. Usually both wins and losses outnumber their ties at mid-levels. At the highest levels, aggressive players tend to be the best at raw calculation in the game. This includes finding obscure wins that few other players would think to look for, making their unsafe-looking plays actually safe, or giving their opponents the most possible opportunities to mess up by calculating how many wins, losses, or ties are possible from each position and picking the best option. The main disadvantage to this style is that it's inherently unsafe. If an aggressive player miscalculates a position, this mistake is generally more likely to be a loss than if a defensive player does. Aggressive play is not turn dependent, but as with defensive play, it's very common to see a player who is both aggressive in general and falls under one of the turn dependent styles. Some common hand-making tendencies. A. In sets with plus wall, will create hands that can take the highest numbers from each direction. For example, a double or triple number in each direction to take A's in level 9 or 10 sets. B. Gimmicky hands, such as those based around a weird number. C. Complex hands, that the player themselves might not remember how it is supposed to work if they haven't used it in a while. Looking at you, Deli. D. Often overthinks their hands, attempting to find the most ideal cards to set up combos from any spot on the board. Initiative. The initiative playstyle is all about taking control of the match. Control is often established through traps, both obvious and complex, good starters, or moves that threaten several spots on the board. Defensive control is established through starters and other moves that their opponents have no way to take or set up to take safely. Aggressive control is established through traps and tricks to force their opponent to choose between two or more poor moves. One key trait of an initiative player's game is their first turn starters, which are usually developed far beyond other players at the same skill level as them. A good starter will allow them to establish control of the match by giving them safe spots, creating unsafe spots for their opponents, or guaranteeing them a secured card if their opponent takes their starter in the beginning. Some players will typically play a defensive starter to give a solid foundation for the rest of the match, whether playing aggressively or defensively on future turns. Others will look for starters with the sole purpose of shutting down their opponent's options. At any level, an initiative player will often learn traps and tricks from other players. If you've done something clever against them in the past, expect to see it again. At the highest levels, these players tend to have the best traps and best first-turn starters out of all players. Since this playstyle is much more effective first turn, these players tend to be noticeably better if they get first turn. It follows that their second turn play is weaker, and most players will have a higher chance against an initiative player if they go first. It is common for initiative players to play defensively when they have second turn, aiming to tie second turn matches, and play aggressively first turn so they can win. It is also common for these players to switch between aggressive and defensive play when playing different players or mid-match to establish control. Some common hand-making tendencies. A. Simple hands can be created in card select. With two or more possible starters, hands are rarely if ever built without at least one starter in mind, unless tournament stips prevent this from happening. Safe corner starters, center starters, or side starters are often built into the hands, along with less obvious starters. B. Power cards with possibilities that make sense with the rules. For example, if plus wall is on for level 9 and 10 sets, double and triple number use is common, but not usually taking over the whole hand, as with aggressive players, as cards are generally taken up to make a starter. Cards will rarely have much synergy with each other outside of the starter game. C. More likely than any other players to use non-AA rares, such as Poo-Poo. Non-AA rares allow for additional tricks to establish control of mid-level 4-8 matches. D. At lower to mid-levels, most likely of all playstyles to steal hands they've seen that they like. At higher levels, these players will stick to their own hands, though. So, for me, the initiative and reactive discussion that we're about to get to do not make as much sense as a way to look at players. And so when I get into how I'm going to categorize players, I'm going to use aggressive and defensive, though I'm going to define them a little differently. But I didn't find a way to categorize players in my head in reactive and initiative. It's not how my view of style works. But I do think it was an interesting division. I think the reactive one that we're about to get to is the weakest of the four explanations, and it's why I had the fewest notes here. Is because some of the things seemed either contradictory or not entirely coherent as an explanation here. But all in all, it's really nice always to hear another very strong player's views on styles and how they work. And I would have really loved it if she'd gone in depth on who she thinks fits where. But anyways, continuing with reactive. The reactive playstyle is all about reacting to or countering their opponent's moves. They rarely go into a match with a plan, but let their opponent's moves and hands dictate everything they'll do. Defensive reactions include moves that their opponents can't take or set up to take safely. Aggressive reactions include taking cards that their opponents can't take back or capitalizing on other mistakes. Reactive players tend to be less aware of their own strengths and weaknesses than those of other players. Several players will go through greater lengths preparing hands to counter weaknesses of specific opponent hands, or tendencies than they would preparing what to do with said hands once they get into the match. Many players aren't even quite sure of their own preference in the game, such as what turn they do best on in general. If asked about any kind of plan, they'll give answers such as, I just wing it, or go with the flow. Most reactive players think of the game in terms of the cards, instead of as the players behind the cards. They will mainly prepare to counter certain types of cards, set up synergy with their own cards, etc., as opposed to thinking of how their opponents as players are exploitable. At any level, a reactive player is likely to think, how do I get around this, whenever their opponents do something? At the highest level, reactive players are the most adaptive out of all players. They are least likely to be thrown off guard and are most able to come up with new ideas on the fly. Since this playstyle is much more effective second turn, reactive players are noticeably better at second turn. Most players have a higher chance against a reactive player going second. Reactive players tend to be weaker at starting, since they rarely have a plan for that before the match, and are also weaker at establishing control in a match. Some common hand-making tendencies. A. Preparatory cards, like card A in case opponent uses a lot of 5s, card B in case opponent uses 7s, etc. B. No plan starters. A reactive player would just wing it when the match starts, which can often backfire first turn. C. Counter hands after ties in a set are very common. These players are also more likely than others to look up other matches in round-robin or pool-style tournaments for the purpose of creating counter hands. D. Hands tend to focus mainly on synergy between individual cards, such as to set up sames and pluses. So this is, as an aside, where one of the places I started to find I'm not quite sure, because when you have the here's my card in case they use 5s, here's my card in case they use 7s, it is then hard to also have those cards have your synergy between individual cards. And if they do start having synergy between individual cards, I thought that sort of more often naturally led into other styles more focused on here's my synergies, I have this center set up. And I also have found, and maybe other people haven't found this, but when testing different hands and playing around with them, like I think of 8876s, for instance, or 8866s as a card that naturally, for instance, handles 10s in the opponent hand. It makes sure if they have a rare for that corner, I will be able to deal with it easily rather than having difficulty against an AA corner. It is sort of a card that strikes me as a reactive. I'm going to make sure I can deal and be able to take your cards. But I also find those cards can underperform on second turn when given options to take safety, because you do not have A's or as many 9s in your hand. You do not have as many opportunities to just simply have a safe square and start building from there. And I actually think, while it is sort of a reactive thing, it can be a second turn problem. And it strikes me that one of my weaknesses towards the end of my run was I was picking cards I would be thinking of as very reactive, and maybe she wouldn't define them that way, but it in fact made me a much weaker second turn player than I should have been had I continued with hands I had sort of paid more attention in making. And so I'm not sure how clear a picture from my experience of playing this all puts together, but for other people it might make a lot more sense, and I hope it does. She then concludes, for all players, strengths are easier to improve upon than weaknesses. Because of this, when players improve, they tend to improve in all areas overall, with strengths becoming stronger and weaknesses becoming less weak. As a result, playstyles will not drastically change in short periods of time once a player reaches a certain stage in their development. Slight changes may happen, such as a player with aggressive tendencies becoming more aggressive, but chances are low that someone will turn to the opposite style once they've developed in a certain direction. At higher levels of play, weaknesses will translate into less strong as opposed to weak. In other words, a top-level player isn't bad at anything, but comparatively less strong in some areas than others. Those weaknesses are exploitable to other high-level players, but will not seem to exist to anyone below a certain skill level. For example, a high-level initiative player might be less strong at second-turn matches, but will still outplay anyone who is bad even when going second. When looking at hands from other players, initiative and reactive players are much more likely to find each other's players' hands unusable, especially those from their polar opposites. This is because the thought processes and mindsets of initiative and reactive players in the first two moves of the match are very different from each other, and require completely different types of hands to make their strengths more effective. Aggressive and defensive players do have certain hand-making tendencies, but can play effectively with hands that aren't typical of their playstyles. A player who has no hand preference at all is usually dead center on the initiative-reactive scale, and can be either aggressive or defensive, but is usually not at the extreme end of this scale. So we will now leave Brock's discussion and move on to sort of my thinking about styles, which isn't particularly well thought through, but hopefully we can get somewhere with it. So I have two examples, one of which I didn't make a diagram for, and I really should have, but let's first consider not the picture here, but pretend they had just played Yuna in the corner in 9, the 9-6-4A and 9. By definitions here, capturing is often an aggressive move, and I think a lot of people define capturing as an aggressive or attacking thing. And if we look here, I think, maybe not with the cards in the example, again, I didn't set up an example for this and I really should have, but if you look at my videos on capturing a starter, which I made a bunch of, I think the core reason to capture a starter, unless the starter is obviously a stupid corner, but the core reason to capture specifically a corner starter is not that they can't capture back. If that happens, great, you do it, that's great, they made a suspicious move. But the more common reason in my play is because I have a card, say they've gone in 9, I have a card that would be safe in 3 if they can't go in 6. So if I capture from 6, I sort of oblige them to go in 8 to secure their starter, and I can now play that safe move in 3. And if I control 5 after that, so they have trouble attacking my card in 6, I can start building out a really strong defense. So I see capturing corner starters, usually, though not necessarily, as a very defensive conception, right? I am setting up future defense by blocking off certain squares on the board. And there's lots of positions where I would play a capture that I think wasn't in most players' kind of repertoire or moves they considered, not because they had trouble recapturing, but because it blocked future squares I wanted blocked for my future defensive setups. And so when I played early captures, it tended to be a very defensive concept rather than an offensive one. And this is going to get to where I really differ from players that see capturing as an inherently offensive scheme. I don't think capturing has much to do inherently with offense or defense. We'll get to that in a moment. My other example here is in this position, if you're the blue player, you'll notice your hand is very vertical. And the hand's natural setup, this was from a hand I used to play a bunch and I think was a really good hand designed to start Flint, as you can see in 5. One way to follow it up is Cipher in 1, right? We put 6-9-A4 in 1, and suddenly A4-8-7 has big combos in both 2 and 4. And I would define this as a more defensive move, right? I am setting up such that all my cards work together to recapture each other and potentially have combos against their cards, but I'm just making sure my cards have as many combo squares set up by my own cards as possible. And this might define as an initiative playstyle as well. I'm not sure how Brock would define this, but one way to play it would be 6-9-A4 in 1. And again, we haven't seen all the cards here. I'm doing more conceptual than saying in this exact example you should play this move. But I think that would be the natural defensive follow-up this hand has. But the other way this hand can play is to say, I am very good going up and down. My 8-7-A4 in 5 specifically kind of powers up my A4-8-7, which now is fantastic if it lands in 4 or 6, capturing anything you could put in 1 or 3. So another way to play would be to go in 2. And that would be saying, rather than I am setting up combos with my cards, I am controlling squares. I have cards that are really powerful at taking things you might potentially play. And that is where I would start defining aggressive versus defensive, where I would say capturing isn't particularly either, but defensive is more towards playing strong corners and making sure we can recapture and that our cards play well together. with each other on the board, right? There's stuff on the board playing well together. And I would say aggressive is more playing against squares, playing to control stuff that is not yet on the board. And a more aggressive or defensive focus, to my understanding, is a focus more on whether we are focusing on what is on the board and what we are immediately putting on the board, or what remains in players' hands. And so the players I will define as defensive are players I see as more focused on the board, and players I will define as aggressive and setting up and defending the cards they have on the board. And players I will define as more offensive are players who will be setting up things for future control of the board, for control of space. And I don't have an inherent take on a preferability of one of these. I think, it's positionally dependent and everyone's biases swing one way or the other. But I think this means I define attacking and defending differently than most players do. And if my definition isn't compelling, then you are probably going to hate how I categorize players. So yes, I talk about that here. I say defense being controlling one's cards through setting up these synergies, and offense being controlling space through setting up synergies. And offense might be setting up big combos rather than taking safety. That's one way to do it. But offense can just be, setting up that J setup where there's cards in like 2, 5, and 7, and you have cards that are good at capturing where they might go, and you can apply a lot of pressure that way. While defense might more be setting up opposite corners. That was one example I gave. There are of course times when both those moves can act in the opposite way, much like capturing a starter, I tend to think of as defensive, and most players tend to think of as an offensive thing to do. So for me, capturing play, it entirely depends on what it's trying to do to fit which category. If it's blocking squares so we can further control their remaining cards, it might be offense. If it's blocking squares such that we have safety after, it's definitely going to be defense, right? There can be lots of reasons why capturing play could be one or the other, and I would think maybe if I were to better define this, I could have offense and defense as the x-axis, and the y-axis might be capturing versus less capturing play, which I'm going to sort of call traditional versus untraditional shortly. So I have divided into, I think, 6 categories, and the first is dynamic attackers. So this is players focused on, they're very much controlling space, but they are setting up a lot of dynamic synergies. And they will often consider early direct captures or adjacent plays more than other players would. But I find these the most, they're setting up a lot of synergies, but they're also really controlling the space on the board. And Delial, Karmazin, and D, I think, are all pretty clear examples of this style. I do think they all fit in well. I have noticed this is where the players playing lots of like level 10 trade in open show up. I think Scythe might fit this category, and I will count him as in it. I'm not as sure on that one. I always found these players really fun to watch, and a very exciting style. Then we have traditional attackers. And these players are going to fit a bit more into formation. I think they're going to be very much less capturing players. Though maybe that's wrong. Kona definitely. Yeah, so all my categories are going to maybe be a little suspicious. Less focused on early captures, but looking to interact, right? The kind of thing where you play a corner, they're likely to play an adjacent corner and start pressuring it by playing nearby, right? They're less likely to play opposite corners, though of course they will still play opposite corners, some of the time, because a lot of the time opposite corners are clearly correct. But these are players that look to interact, not by directly taking, but by playing nearby, setting up potential combos or, pluses, sames. But I think they fit on the attacking side of the spectrum, but within the kind of space of not particularly looking to capture immediately. Obviously, in the late game, you do lots of captures, and looking to interact with what you're doing. Then there are untraditional attackers. These are specifically players that I had trouble with, but they were players that I think both captured more than other attackers often do, but also captured by overpowering, not necessarily sticking with stuff that looks clean, the comfortable plus wall, but stuff that leaves the game messy because there's going to be potential combos down the road. And I think they handled those resulting complications really well. So I have MC and Kamikaze as untraditional attackers. Then I have a calculation above all group. I probably overpowered this group, but they are players I'm more familiar with, and they're really strong players. Great Sephiroth was known as Supercomputer, which is why I googled an image of Supercomputer and stuck it there. I think I, when in trouble, relied kind of on my ability to calculate my way out above my ability to intuit a way out. And I think, Yojimbo and Great Sephiroth both also played on a site where they played correspondence, and you'd have multiple days to make a move and could just explore every possibility, and they were both really phenomenally good at doing that. Sujiro has also talked a lot about how the game at a certain point becomes pure calculation, and extending the ability, how far you can pure calculate out, is, a huge measure of your overall strength. So I put these as the four players of kind of, I'm not sure where they fall on an aggressive defensive scale. I know I moved around over time, but tended to think of myself as sort of towards the middle. And I think the other players here are kind of too, sort of balanced, but balanced, leaning into calculation. Then we have traditional defenders. I put Nightwish here, Sir Smokes, and Kaus. Didn't necessarily play that many games with Kaus, but the one tournament game I played against him, he very clearly was looking for safety in a way that I thought fit this category nicely. All very strong players. This is going to end up looking like a weaker category because these players, while they all had really high win rates, happen to not have particularly good win rates against the other players I've put in categories. So this category is going to end up looking like a weaker category. But I think kind of traditional defensive play is very sound, good play. Nightwish being, in my opinion, the strongest example of it. And you might say Nightwish isn't an example of it, and either I've done a bad job categorizing or you define styles differently than I do. Again, I'd love to hear if people think various people land in different categories than I think. I did not feel confident about much of this, and would really love to hear thoughts on style, because I think it's a weird thing to dive into and not one I have a good feel for. So putting together, the best video I can, but I make no claims to this being particularly accurate. I think traditional defender is kind of the most natural sound style to fall into. And then there are the ultra defenders, Slash of Time being the example I mocked the most. I also put Kazik here. I ended up not including Bren or Piggyman, and this is specifically because I wanted to focus on players that really built around strong corners and built around getting safety from there, and things like playing 8-8 corners on level 7 with some variation. I mocked Slash of Time because I thought I treated him as if he was a player who always did the same thing every game. He very much didn't. Any really good player, as Brock points out, is doing a lot of things fantastically. But very clearly at the defensive end of the spectrum, I think Kazik was there too. I considered Bren. I didn't know much about his style. I've now seen it in the AI tournaments I'm running and thought he probably fits in this category, though he could fit into traditional defender, but clearly on the defensive end of the spectrum. But he tended to build out of sides, building safety out of sidelines, out of side starters, and that didn't quite fit what I wanted here. Piggyman also very much building synergy between the cards, using one card to set up his next card, to set up his next card, rather than looking to as much control the space of your cards. He's looking to make sure his own cards can work perfectly together. But given how differently he treats corners and how much more of a central starter he was, and maybe this is somewhere where Brock's initiative reactive could come in, where Piggyman is maybe very high initiative as well as very high defense, while someone like Slash of Time or Kazik might be a little more reactive or more central on that scale than Piggyman is. Maybe that starts to get at that. But I ended up not including Brennan Piggyman in the head-to-head records we're going to include in a bit, because I thought they were a different kind of defender I didn't really have a place for. So then we have Sedo, and Sedo is someone who I've always been confused by. Phenomenal at dealing with combos in the deep distance where he'd have it planned the whole way, and it just comes out of nowhere to the unexpecting player. I always thought of him as more defensive. He likes his AA corners. He would play Doom Train if that's available on the rule set, cards like that. But he also, if he had Doom Train and it wasn't good in 3, he might play it in 7 where its 2 weak numbers are showing. I always thought of him as the master of the weak corner, and where does that fit in on stylistic spectrum? I kind of think of that as control of space. And so he did a lot of things that I think were a bit different than everyone else, and it's hard to put him somewhere. So I'm saying I didn't include Sedo in one of the categories, and there are lots of other awesome players I didn't stick in a category. Some because I didn't have the familiarity. I did place people I probably just didn't have enough familiarity to place, but there are others I had even less familiarity with, or have forgotten because this is, a decade plus ago, mostly. And others didn't fit a category. I talked about how Brendan Piggy I didn't feel comfortable putting in. Players like that that I have some familiarity with, I still didn't feel fit the categories I made, which might mean I made bad categories. And as I said, a lot of people I put in, I'm sure I got the categories wrong. But now we're going to look at how the different groups look. So we have these 6 styles, and here's who I've put in each group. Here's who I'm going to be counting. This was enough players in each that we got samples of, each group, as I can get to in the next slide. Each group played kind of 30 to 50 games against other members of this group. So it's small samples, but it's not like 4-game samples, right? It's slightly bigger. The groups I put more players in, we get more games out of, or the groups that had more successful tournament players. Here, calculators looks a bit overpowered as a group. This is not to say being a calculator is the best style. It's to say the people I happen to think stuck here did really well. And this is not to say traditional defensive is a weak group. It's to say the people I happen to stick there didn't perform great against other people that I happened to put in other groups. So we can now look at how the different ones did against each other, and here is the head-to-head record between each group. DA stands for dynamic aggressive, UA stands for untraditional aggressive. I may start switching to calling it attacker at some point. I kind of use those terms interchangeably. TA is traditional aggressive, C is calculators, TD is traditional defensive, and UD is ultra defensive. Across tells you their record against each. So in the first row you can see dynamic aggressive does really well against ultra aggressive, not well against traditional aggressive, and runs even against calculators, about even against ultra defensive, and does well against traditional defensive. So you can look at dynamic aggressive and see the only group they put up a clear negative against is traditional aggressive, which is sort of interesting, and I'm not sure what to reason from that. Again, these are small samples, but maybe it says something about the players who kind of played a little more sound and safe did well in the matchup against people who took more risks. But maybe this doesn't line up at all, because untraditional aggressive do badly against dynamic aggressive, but every other group they have a plus score against, even including calculators and their high win percentage. They put up a slight plus against traditional aggressive, and clear pluses against traditional defensive and ultra defensive. And you can look through the groups. I also, if you want to stay on this screen, you can pause. I also just do the win percentages, so you can see each group's win percentages against other groups. And so you can see here easily that untraditional aggressive really only has problems with one group and puts up plus scores everywhere else. Calculators have problems with that untraditional aggressive group, but do pretty well against everyone else. But the thing is, if I put weaker players in a group, its win percentages are going to look weaker. So we might think, oh, traditional defensive looks terrible. So I then adjusted saying, okay, let us normalize against your overall win percentage, right? If your overall win percentage is 40 and you perform 50% against another group, you're performing above your normal against another group. So here we have who did you do better or worse against than you did against the field as a whole. And here we can see, for instance, that untraditional aggressive really dropped off against dynamic aggressive, again, small samples, but really overperformed against the defensive players. Their kind of complex style, if we are to draw conclusions, really looks like it was effective there. And you can see different results for different groups of who was overperformed and who was underperformed. And just to make that a little clearer, I converted that chart into, a plus means you beat a group by a bit. 2 pluses means you beat a group by a lot. Equals means your matchup against them was close to even compared to what you were expected to do. 1 minus means it was a bad matchup for you relative to your normal. And 2 minuses means it was a really bad matchup. So hopefully giving this in lots of different chart forms helps something. I don't know. Maybe you notice something that is interesting. So if this is accurate, right, if this correctly defines which groups do well against other groups, then you can potentially look at players who I couldn't fit in a group and see which group they would have fit in. So, for instance, Sedo crushes every group except Dynamic, Aggressive, and Calculators, and both of which he runs even with. And if you look at the previous charts, and think, which category does that fit him into, it likely puts him in either Dynamic, Aggressive, or Calculator, or Ultra Defensive. Those are the three groups that most naturally fit those win rates. But those are on opposite ends of the spectrum. We have one that's the far aggressive, one that's the far defensive, and one that's in the middle. And I think that's kind of a funny result for Sedo to land in, because, as I've said, I had trouble defining his style, and it is goofy that this measure would put him as everywhere on the spectrum, right? Vid's results look like he would be a traditional aggressive player, and I don't know where I'd have guessed him. I think I would have put him in one of the traditional categories, but I'm not sure I would have leaned aggressive or defensive. So I'm not sure to make of that as kind of a confirmation. Yes, that is where I'd put him, or probably not where I'd have put him. Cookie's line also makes him look like traditional aggressive, and I would have guessed traditional defensive is where Cookie would land. But I don't know Cookie's play that well, and obviously I came around after the peak of Cookie's career, so may not have seen him when he was at his best, but I would have guessed on the defensive end of the spectrum, and this might suggest that my categories are wrong, or these head-to-head results are not showing very much. So, what do we think overall? I'm not sure. We still have the sample troubles. If we could put more players in each category, that would help a lot. So, as I'll make the repeated plea, if you have what you think are better understandings of style, or ones that can include more players, I'd love to do bigger samples. And so, if you have thoughts on style, I would love to hear them. What hot takes can we conclude? If we were to draw some conclusions from this, and we probably shouldn't, I think one would be that dynamic attackers, untraditional attackers are taking these risks. They're doing these things that potentially lead to combos later, and dynamic attackers, the most kind of complicated aggressive players, are the best at taking advantage of that. But dynamic attackers then have trouble with the sounder level of traditional attackers, who untraditional attackers can throw off. So you have a sort of rock, paper, scissors there, but it's small samples. I don't know how true that really is, but seems like it could be plausible. Calculators do really well against traditional play, but once we get into the far ends of the spectrum, either ultra defensive or dynamic attackers or untraditional attackers, they have more trouble. You have to, against players who are above all calculators, you have to do things that throw off their expected moves. Ultra defenders were the most consistent across the board. Whoever it is they play, they put up kind of similar win rates. They have the least range of result, least variety of how they perform depending on the opponent. And whoever they play, they're going to perform at a somewhat consistent rate. Seems to be what, again, the minimal evidence shows. But my main takeaway is either I have not categorized players well, or the larger definitions of stylistic groups do not say much about how they'll do against each other, or the sample is too small to show stuff that would be useful. I think one of those three things is the case, because I don't think there was much to draw from this. And where can we go from here? What's the point of styles? So I offered some stylistic groupings here. I don't think I did a great job. I did what seemed reasonable to me and did not reach satisfying conclusions here. If you have alternative groupings, I would love to hear them. If someone has better groups that they can, put more players in each group so we can get a larger sample to compare styles with, that would be awesome. I think the best way to do it would be to have fewer groups, because the more groups I have, the fewer games each group will have against each other group, the fewer people will be in each group. So one way to do it might have just been have an aggressive group, a balanced group, a defensive group. Another way to do it might have been Brock's system with the 4 groups. Either way, I think if someone else was to come up with a set of styles and who fits in each, I would love to do analysis of that. But I think doing more than 4 distinct styles is going to be too many to get real data from. So I think the goal for another attempt at this would be have 3 or 4 style types. I'm also going to be, I've been making actually a lot of progress with some AI on this, and we're going to have very different styles on them. Some that look to control the board more, some that look to control the cards in the opponent's hand and make sure they can't have safety. some that are going to be looking to play strong corners, others that look to play weak corners, some that look to use the cards that seem most powerful, and others that look to hold on to them. And hopefully, because I can run the AIs against each other tons of times and get big samples of results, it might be interesting and possible to show stylistic differences there. So I'm curious how that will work out. Have been making progress, which is cool, and hope that leads to something, because it'll be neat if one AI is clearly better than another, but in the head-to-head underperforms that over a large sample due to stylistic advantages or disadvantages against each other. And so I guess that's the end of the video. I'm curious what styles other people think exist. Do you like my aggressive first defensive definition of controlling hands and space versus controlling the board? Does that make sense to people, or do you prefer the kind of looks to capture versus looks to play safely, more normal definitions that people use? And who do you think are examples of styles? I'm sure some of the players I've categorized will watch this video and think, that doesn't define my style at all. And so, curious what people think, and I would really love it if someone came up with bigger, fewer groups of styles with more players in each for me to be able to do further testing with and see if there really is any advantage to certain styles against certain other styles.